Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Mike Moffatt from the Smart Prosperity Institute, and there's been a lot of talk the last week or so about this memo that the Immigration Department sent out a couple years ago that warned that if with given the high levels, it's going to affect the prices of housing, and some people are treating this like a scandal. I don't seem to think that it is one because it was fairly common sense. And we are not discussing the counterfactuals that go along with that, but I figured we would have this chat with Mike. Mike.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so obviously I haven't seen this memo, but it seems to be an exercise in the blindingly obvious, right? That
Yeah.
if you increase the demand for housing, that will, all else being equal, cause the price of housing, whether it be the price of homes or rents, to go up. So there's nothing really shocking here, and a number of us, myself included, has been talking about this well before 2022. And it's also the job of people in the public service to talk about any policy and talk about unintended consequences, and every policy is going to have an unintended consequence. So it's nothing really shocking. I would be more shocked if a memo like this didn't exist. I would actually be more worried if that was the case,
Yeah,
if nobody in the
definitely.
public service pointed this out. So it is a nothing burger in my opinion, but it could be if it leads to a useful discussion of immigration policy and the role of non-permanent residents and so on. I think that can be a helpful thing.
Yeah. The other thing that I don't think enough people have been just mentioning is just the acuity of the labor shortage that was going on at the time, and how many, premiers you had begging the federal government to bring in more immigrants, and what the knock-on effect of that would have been had we restricted the numbers because of housing availability.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think that's really one of the important things to note here is that the provinces have been asking for this. They've been particularly asking for the numbers to be increased and those numbers to be put into provincial nominee programs.
Yeah.
So had the federal government said no to that or held the line, there would have been criticism. Had they, and that's on the permanent residency side, and obviously we have all of these non-permanent residency side, and if the federal government had come in and said, okay, you know what, we're going to really ratchet down temporary foreign workers, we would have heard issues. And had they said, okay, you know what, we're going to cap international student enrollments, we think, there's too many of those, you would have heard screaming for the provinces at the time going like, you're going to bankrupt our institutions. So,
Yeah.
it's one of the challenges here that the federal government has is that, that the moves that they made at the time were relatively popular, but now the tide has turned, and nobody wants to be particularly associated with them.
For sure. And on the notion of temporary foreign workers, I always have two things on this one. One of them is on the Quebec side, it's one of these weird things where the province keeps demanding more temporary foreign workers, but they say they have too many immigrants and they can't integrate them. So there's a big policy issue there. But the other one is all these international students, and in particular, because you've been pointing this out a lot, from the private colleges, most especially in Ontario. And I've read stories, horror stories, in some magazines about some of the experiences some of these students have coming over. They're going to these storefront colleges, having a really terrible experience, not being able to find, get any support. And my question is always, where's the provinces on this? This should be their bailiwick.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and they've been allowed to skate on this a little bit. And the situation in Ontario is a little bit complex, where you do have these sort of private colleges that exist, but you also have these kind of hybrid private public, like 3P arrangements, private public partnerships. That basically what happens is that the overseas student applies and gets into a public institution, but the public institution outsources designs the curricula and outsources the teaching to basically a strip mall college. And that's where you've seen a lot of the growth. And this has been a known issue at the time here, that back in 2016, the Wynne government started to get concerned about this. They had a public servant, issue a report that came out in 2017, and he said, like, look, you've got to. The recommendation was basically like, you've got to put a stop to these 3P arrangements. Not so much because of housing risk, but just that they were growing out of control and causing reputational risk for our higher education sector. That we were bringing in a lot of students. They were getting, very sort of poor quality education. And, should something happen to one of these private institutions, let's say just one of them goes bankrupt overnight, that puts the public colleges at a material risk. So back in 2018, the Wynne government said, okay, we're going to wind these down over the next 2 years. But we had an election, and we all know how that turned out. And the Ford government decided to undo that. So that reversal, coupled with the tuition freeze and lowering, and other changes, has basically created a Wild West situation Ontario. And if we look at the international student issue, I mean, it really is isolated to some pockets of the country. It's a Southern Ontario, a GVA, and kind of strangely a Cape Breton issue out in Nova Scotia.
Right.
Otherwise, the international student issue, if you want to call it, is a nothing burger in Saskatchewan. It doesn't exist in Manitoba, even in Quebec. You don't, even in Montreal, you don't have these tensions. It really is a Vancouver, Toronto, Brampton, London, and again, oddly enough, Cape Breton issue. So all real estate is local, and that's certainly the case with this one. It is a hyper local issue.
Yeah, and this is one, or just another one of those examples where the federal government seems to be taking a disproportionate amount of the blame for this. I know that yes, they issue the visas, but is this something that they had the capacity to check in on these institutions? Would have been my question.
Well, they certainly could have. I mean, they can at least, can they go around doing inspections? No. But what they could have done is, looked at the enrollment numbers and go, okay, yeah, this seems to be a problem, and basically cap enrollments or cap visas the same way we do with immigration, right? With immigration, we have a target, and that target's increased, but we have this kind of growth plan. There's nothing stopping the federal government from doing the same on non-permanent residency, having some kind of cap, allocating that cap to institutions, to regions, to provinces, what have you, and then going, okay, we're only going to allow 10,000 students to this institution or 50,000 students to this province, and then you decide which who are going to get those spots. So the federal government has absolutely the ability to do that. I think overall, I mean, the federal government's run into two problems here. One is that there's a real hesitancy to pick a fight with the provinces, or even point out the responsibilities of the provinces.
Yes.
Had the federal government in 2022 said, yeah, no, we're watching this. We think the federal government, we think the provinces should rein this in, and if we don't, they don't, we'll have no choice to act. They would have done themselves some favors, but their inability to both communicate what's going on and to pick a fight with the provinces is essentially their undoing, right? Because they're not telling their story and they're not stepping in, and Canadians are not experts on the Constitution, so they're just looking at this national problem going, well, why, and going, well, the federal government has this lever to do something about it, why aren't they using it?
Yeah, no, this government's inability to communicate, I'm shocked.
It seems to be it seems to be an ongoing issue, and again,
Yeah.
the inability to, or lack of desire to create these tensions with the provinces, which is a little bit surprising. Again, because you have a federal Liberal government and a provincial Conservative government in Ontario, you would think there would be more willingness to bump heads, but that hasn't been the case to date.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, it's a common refrain on a number of other fronts as well, and stuff that I'm tracking on the legal side as well, where you've got provinces doing blatantly unconstitutional things, and the federal government's not stepping in and challenging them. I'm like,
Yeah, and I think it's affecting
yeah,
affecting the federal government. It might explain some of the polling that we've seen over the last 6 to 9 months.
definitely. So I guess my other, concern with this whole topic is how are we able to have this kind of conversation without it simply turning into this kind of nativist argument where immigrants are being blamed for housing shortages when, I mean, it's a much more complex ecosystem than that.
Yeah, it is a much more complicated ecosystem, and I think what we have to recognize is it's not the responsibility of some 18-year-old kid in Warsaw who wants to go to U of T to solve Canada's housing crisis, right? That's
Yeah.
the job of our policymakers, and that's our job of our institutions to be responsible when it comes to enrollment, whether they're a private college, a public college, or a public university. So I think that's part of it. And I think one of the challenges we've had, and I say this as somebody kind of more on the progressive side of the spectrum, is we've been unwilling to weigh into this debate because of those fears, because of those
Yeah.
very real fears that, okay, we don't want to stigmatize people. Totally understandable. The challenge is, I think, twofold. The first of all, it allows these issues to get out of hand because we're not sounding the alarm. But two, it creates a vacuum, and kind of the loudest and most obnoxious and frankly, and sometimes the most racist voices end up taking that vacuum. So, I get the discomfort. I feel it as well. I have to say, whenever I do one of these discussions or one of these interviews, I'm more cognizant myself of the terms I use and the phrasing I use. Whether if you and I are talking about what the Bank of Canada is doing,
Yeah,
I'm less in my head about saying, okay, be careful about the terms you use. But here I'm being hyper careful. So I get the instinct, but I think we need to have these conversations, because if we don't have them, somebody else will.
for sure. And also just having these conversations with the provinces as well, because
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to bang on that drum again.
It is, yeah, it is absolutely shocking how provinces have been able to skate on this again, particularly the government here in Ontario, and I don't even say that in a partisan way, because this was happening under the Wynne government and largely flying under the radar as well. So. I think there's a whole discussion there about, the media's attention of federal issues versus provincial issues, particularly here in Ontario, where I don't think the provincial government ever gets enough scrutiny. That unlike, say, in Alberta, our focus tends to be far more federal, far more what's going on in Ottawa, and a little bit less so on what's happening in Toronto.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thanks so much for having this conversation, and hopefully we will have some more enlightened discussion as a result of it. So thanks again.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale_no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.